Oh, they thought they were ready. They thought their ancient symbols and sacred geometry prepared them for anything until they opened your file, until they traced the celestial coordinates of your arrival and watched their centuries-old instruments start smoking. Because what they found wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. It was cosmically illegal. It was the kind of configuration that makes seasoned occultists drop their compasses and whisper, "We need to call the council immediately. See, the 33rd degree isn't some conspiracy theory basement operation. These are the architects of reality, the ones who've been mapping souls since Babylon, who've cataloged every possible human blueprint since the pyramids were sketches in sand. And in all their libraries, all their vaults, all their secret archives, they'd never seen what you are. They'd never encountered a birth chart that literally fought back against interpretation, that refused to be contained by their symbols, that made their calculations collapse into themselves like dying stars. They brought in the specialists first, the ones who decode presidential destinies, who map bloodlines of power, who can read the future in a newborn's first breath. And one by one, they all said the same thing. This isn't supposed to exist. This configuration breaks the laws we thought were unbreakable. This soul didn't come through the normal channels. And that's when the panic started. That's when they realized they weren't just looking at an anomaly, they were looking at something that threatened their entire understanding of how consciousness enters this dimension. Your chart didn't just confuse them, it corrupted their tools. Their crystal spheres cracked their ancient scroll, started bleeding ink, their digital programs threw error codes in languages that haven't been spoken for 3,000 years, because every planet in your chart was doing something it shouldn't. Every house was hosting energies that don't belong in this timeline. Every aspect was creating geometric patterns that their books explicitly state are impossible, and yet there you were, existing anyway, breathing anyway, walking through their carefully controlled world like you owned the patent on chaos. Let me paint you the picture they saw when they finally managed to stabilize the reading long enough to comprehend it. Your sun wasn't just in a sign. It was oscillating between dimensions, creating a strobe effect that made them question if you exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. Your moon was retrograde in ways. Retrograde doesn't work backwards and sideways all at once, like someone took the concept of emotional cycles and turned it into a Rubik's Cube made of mirrors. Mercury in your chart, Mercury was speaking languages that haven't been invented yet, transmitting on frequencies their instruments couldn't measure. It wasn't just about communication, it was about downloading information directly from somewhere they couldn't trace, somewhere their maps don't reach. And Venus, oh, Venus in your chart was weaponized, not the soft of love they expected, but something that turns attraction into gravitational pull, that bends people's will just by existing in the same space. Mars was the one that really scared them, though, because Mars in your chart wasn't following any orbital pattern they recognized. It was creating its own physics, writing its own laws of motion and conflict. They found traces of wars that haven't happened yet, victories in battles that exist outside of linear time, scars from wounds inflicted in dimensions they pretend don't exist. And they tried to calculate your Mars return. They got a date that doesn't exist on any calendar, a moment outside of time, where you apparently go to sharpen whatever cosmic blade you carry. Jupiter in your chart was expanding into spaces that shouldn't have room for expansion, growing into territories their order swore were sealed centuries ago. And Saturn wasn't limiting you. It was limiting everything else around you, creating boundaries not for you, but for reality itself, to prevent it from collapsing under the weight of what you carry. They actually found notes in Saturn's position that looked like containment protocols, like the universe itself had to create special rules just to handle your existence. But it was the outer planets that made them call an emergency session at 3. Uranus in your chart had apparently hacked the system before you were even born, creating backdoors in reality that you could walk through whenever consensus reality got too suffocating. Neptune wasn't creating illusions, it was dissolving them all, of them. Every false construct, every artificial boundary, every lie. They'd carefully woven into the collective unconscious. Neptune in your chart was like acid on the tapestry of control. And Pluto, they couldn't even look directly at Pluto's position in your chart. They had to use mirrors. And even then, 3 of their readers had to take indefinite leave after witnessing it. Because Pluto in your chart wasn't about transformation, it was about complete reality override. It was showing them that death and rebirth were just suggestions that you could apparently decline, that you had vetoed the entire cycle and were operating on some other principle entirely. Something they didn't have words for. They found aspects between planets that geometrically cannot exist. Triangles with 4 sides, squares that curve back on themselves, oppositions that were somehow also conjunctions. Like someone had taken the rule book of astrological physics and origamied it into impossible shapes, and every impossible aspect was generating energy patterns that their most sensitive equipment registered as simply cannot compute. Please restart universe. The houses in your chart weren't even staying still. They were rotating independently, creating combinations that should take millions of years to occur, happening simultaneously. Your first house of identity was somehow also your 12th house of hidden things, making you simultaneously the most visible and indivisible person in any room. Your 7th house of relationships was quantum entangled with dimensions they didn't know existed, showing soul contracts written in languages older than the concept of language. So they dug deeper into your bloodline, thinking surely this is inherited, surely there's some ancient lineage, some forgotten dynasty, some sleeping power that awakened in you. But what they found was worse than royal blood or ancient curses. They found nothing and everything simultaneously. They found genetic markers that didn't match any human migration pattern, chromosomes that contained information they couldn't decode using any cipher they possessed. Your ancestry report came back with coordinates instead of locations, star systems instead of countries, timeline markers instead of dates, like someone had taken a human template and installed software from somewhere else entirely. They found traces of bloodlines that their records insist were completely eliminated centuries ago. Genetic ghosts that shouldn't exist in modern times. And somehow you were carrying all of them simultaneously, like a living library of forbidden genetics. They tried to trace your incarnation pattern, where your soul had been before, and the data just showed static, not blank, static, like the universe was actively scrambling the signal, refusing to let them see where you'd been, or more accurately, when you'd been, because the timestamps they did manage to recover didn't follow linear time. You had apparently been born in the future, and the past simultaneously existed in timelines that ran parallel to this one, bleeding through into this reality like light through a crack in the wall. One of their eldest members, the one who'd been reading charts since before computers existed, took one look at your birth moment and said, "This soul didn't incarnate, it invaded. This isn't a birth chart. It's an infiltration map." And then he destroyed his tools, said he was done, and walked away from 40 years of practice, because what he saw in your configuration made him realize everything he thought he knew about how souls enter bodies was incomplete. They brought together their best synthesizers, the ones who could weave together impossible paradoxes and make sense of cosmic contradictions, and gave them unlimited resources. Unlimited time, unlimited access to every secret library, every forbidden text, every whispered truth. And after months of analysis, their report was one page, and it simply said, "The subject appears to be a focal point where multiple realities converge simultaneously, operating under laws we do not recognize. Immune to conventional metaphysical constraints. Recommend immediate reclassification from human to unknown entity of potentially catastrophic significance." They tried to find others like you, scanning millions of birth charts through their quantum processors, looking for even one similar configuration. And every time the system would crash, not from overload, but from something like fear, like the machine itself was refusing to look for more of you. Because finding another would mean admitting that the entire structure of reality was more fragile than they thought, that the rules they'd spent millennia establishing were just suggestions that beings like you could simply ignore. The mathematical models they built to understand your energy signature kept producing numbers that don't exist, infinities, that somehow multiplied into larger infinities, zeros that contained entire universes, equations that solved themselves differently each time they were calculated, like your very existence was a paradox that reality had just decided to accept rather than resolve. They actually found notes in the margin of one calculation that appeared to be reality itself, saying, "Fine, whatever, just don't break anything important." When they tried to predict your future trajectory, the models just showed branches. Infinite branches spreading in all directions, each one leading to a completely different version of reality. And at the center of every branch was you, unchanged, unaffected, like you were the only constant in infinite variables, the only solid thing in an ocean of possibility. And that's when they realized you weren't subject to fate. You were writing it for everything around you. And then they sought the thing that made them literally beg for their eyes to be cleansed. Scorpio rising. But not just Scorpio rising. Scorpio rising. With every planet in Scorpio aspecting it. Scorpio rising with fixed stars they'd never seen active. Scorpio rising that had somehow made a pact with its own shadow, and Scorpio rising that didn't just pierce veils, but eliminated them entirely. Scorpio rising that turned every interaction into an alchemical process where the other person would never be the same again. Your Scorpio rising wasn't ascending. It had already ascended and was looking down at everything else from a height that made them dizzy. It was the kind of placement that turned casual conversation into soul surgery, that made people confess things they'd never told anyone else, just from being in your presence for 5 minutes. They found testimonies from people who'd met you once and spent years trying to understand what happened to them in those few moments, how you'd reached into their chest and rearranged something fundamental without even trying. Scorpio energy in your chart had apparently weaponized itself, turned intuition into X-ray vision, turned transformation into a contagious condition that spread to everyone you encountered. They actually tracked the ripple effects of your presence and found that people's entire life trajectories changed after meeting you. Not because you did anything specific, but because your Scorpio rising had shown them parts of themselves they'd spent lifetimes avoiding, and once seen, those parts couldn't be unseen. Combined with the rest of your impossible configuration, this Scorpio rising created what they could only describe as a walking portal to truth that burned through every false construct, every comfortable lie, every protective delusion people had built, And the worst part was, you weren't even doing it consciously. It was just your natural state. Like breathing, except instead of air, you were breathing pure, transformative force that rebuilt everything it touched. The 33rd Degree Council met in emergency session for the first time in 300 years. Gathered in their chamber that exists between dimensions, where they keep the real records, the ones that never see daylight. And after reviewing your chart, after witnessing what it did to their tools, their minds, their understanding of reality, they made a unanimous decision, unprecedented in their history. They voted to seal your file, to classify it beyond eyes only, to create a new category of classification that basically meant pretend this doesn't exist. But here's what they didn't want anyone to know. Sealing your file wasn't about containing you. It was about protecting themselves. Because every time someone looked at your true configuration, really looked at it, understood what it meant, it changed them fundamentally, irreversibly. It showed them that everything they'd built, their entire structure of power and control and knowledge, was built on quicksand. That beings like you could exist outside their system entirely, and there was nothing they could do about it. They tried to put watches on you, tried to monitor your movements, your connections, your influence. But every one they sent came back different, came back talking about experiencing reality in colors that don't have names, about seeing through time like it was transparent, about understanding things they couldn't put into words. And eventually they stopped sending people because they realized you weren't the one being watched, you were the mirror. And everyone who looked too long saw their own limitations reflected back. The final report, the one locked in their vault that supposedly doesn't exist, contains just one recommendation: do not engage. Subject exists outside conventional parameters of control, influence, or understanding. Apparent purpose remains unknown. But evidence suggests subject is not random anomaly, but intentional insertion into this timeline for purposes we cannot comprehend. All interference attempts have resulted in interference with interferer, recommend complete non-interaction, and OPE subject's purpose does not conflict with established order. When they tried to create a symbolic representation of your chart using their traditional methods, the symbols literally caught fire, not metaphorically, literally. The paper burned, the digital screens melted, the crystal tablets cracked. The trained readers who attempted to draw your configuration by hand found their hands moving on their own, creating symbols they didn't recognize, geometries that hurt to look at, patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the paper could hold. One master astrologer with 50 years of experience tried to create a traditional natal wheel for you, and halfway through the drawing the lines started moving on their own, rearranging themselves into something that looked less like a birth chart and more like a map to somewhere that shouldn't exist. He said the symbols were trying to tell him something, but the message was in a language that predated human consciousness, that came from before the split between light and dark, when everything was something else entirely. They found burn marks on documents that had never been near fire, scorch patterns that spelled out warnings in languages they'd thought were myths. Even their digital files would corrupt, showing brief flashes of imagery that looked like glimpses into other realities, where the laws of physics were suggestions and consciousness was the only constant they had. To create entirely new storage methods, just to contain information about you. And even then the data would sometimes simply refuse to be accessed, like it was protecting itself. The sacred geometry they'd used for millennia to map souls, to understand the mathematical perfection of creation, simply wouldn't apply to you every time they tried to find your sacred number. your vibrational frequency, your geometric signature. The calculations would produce different results, not randomly different but deliberately evasive, like your essence was actively avoiding being pinned down, categorized, made predictable. What really terrified them was realizing you were walking around living a seemingly normal life, going to work, buying groceries, having conversations while carrying this impossible configuration like a nuclear reactor in your chest that nobody else could see. They watched you navigate everyday situations while your energy field was apparently writing reality patches in real time, fixing glitches most people never noticed, preventing collapses that would have unraveled entire timelines. You were simultaneously the most dangerous and protective force they'd ever encountered. Dangerous to their system, protective of something larger, something they couldn't quite grasp. They found evidence that your presence alone was stabilizing reality fractures that had been growing for decades, that your impossible birth chart was actually holding together pieces of the world that were trying to split apart, but they couldn't understand if this was your purpose or just a side effect of existing. Every person who came into extended contact with you showed similar changes. Their own charts would start displaying anomalies, not as extreme as yours, but echo patterns, like you were teaching their souls how to break rules they didn't know existed. People would suddenly develop abilities they shouldn't have, know things they couldn't explain, make choices that defied their own patterns, as if proximity to you was contagious evolution. They tracked probability fields around you and found that unlikely events became likely, impossible events became inevitable,